They say respect is earned, not demanded, but what happens when someone has so much money they believe respect is beneath them? The courtroom fell silent, so silent that the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard. All eyes were on Nathaniel Hawthorne, a self-made billionaire in his mid-40s, known for his sharp suits, sharper tongue, and a reputation for ruthless business dealings. As Judge Elise Monroe entered the courtroom, the usual protocol followed. Lawyers, clerks, and attendees rose in unison to show respect to the bench. Everyone stood. Everyone, except Nathaniel. Sitting back in his chair, Nathaniel crossed his legs with deliberate defiance, a smug smirk plastered across his face. The room froze in shock at the billionaire's brazen arrogance, but Judge Monroe's face remained composed. Her eyes, however, burned with something deeper, a quiet, restrained fury. "I see Mr. Hawthorne has decided he's above the decorum of this court," Judge Monroe said, her voice measured but firm. "Care to explain?" Nathaniel leaned forward, brushing an invisible speck of lint from his jacket. "Explain? I wasn't aware standing up was mandatory. Isn't respect supposed to be mutual, Your Honor?" His words dripped with condescension, his tone a venomous challenge. The air thickened with tension. Judge Monroe's response was a calm, calculated silence that spoke louder than any outburst ever could. Finally, she leaned slightly forward, her gaze unwavering. "Very well, Mr. Hawthorne. Since you've chosen to show contempt for this court, I will ensure you understand what accountability looks like. Clerk, note Mr. Hawthorne's refusal for the record. I'll be addressing this disrespect shortly." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. What did she mean by that? Nathaniel's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments, but he quickly recovered, leaning back with a dismissive chuckle. Then, just as the murmurs settled, Judge Monroe delivered her bombshell. "Bailiff, please escort Mr. Hawthorne to the holding cell until he remembers how to respect the authority of this court." The room erupted into chaos. Reporters, present for what was supposed to be a high-profile business trial, scrambled to record the scene. Nathaniel shot up from his seat, his face red with fury. "You can't be serious. I'm Nathaniel Hawthorne. You think you can just—" The bailiff stepped forward, towering over the billionaire. "Sir, you need to come with me." Nathaniel's arrogant protest was drowned out by whispers and stifled laughs from the gallery. The image of a man who had built his empire by crushing others now being escorted out of the courtroom like a common criminal was surreal. Judge Monroe watched calmly as the door slammed behind Nathaniel, her expression unreadable. And just like that, the scene was set for a clash that would not only shake the courtroom, but expose the festering underbelly of power, prejudice, and accountability. The question lingered. What would Judge Monroe do next? It wasn't always like this. To understand how it all spiraled into this moment, you have to go back to the beginning. Nathaniel Hawthorne grew up in a modest home in Boise, Idaho, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. Young Nathaniel learned early that the world wasn't fair. He vowed to rise above it all, no matter the cost. His brilliance in business and ruthless ambition catapulted him to the top. By his early 30s, he was a billionaire. By 40, he was a household name. But with great wealth came a greater sense of entitlement. Nathaniel's success warped his view of the world and of himself. He believed his money made him untouchable. Laws, rules, and social norms were inconveniences for others, not him. On the other side of this story was Judge Elise Monroe, a woman who had fought battles Nathaniel couldn't imagine. Born and raised in Chicago's South Side, Elise had seen firsthand the challenges of systemic inequality. Her father, a history teacher, and her mother, a nurse, instilled in her the importance of integrity, education, and hard work. She graduated top of her class at Harvard Law before becoming one of the youngest and most respected judges in the state. Elise's courtroom was her sanctuary, a place where justice wasn't just a word but a principle. And she was known for her fairness and unshakable resolve, no matter who stood before her bench. The first clash between these two formidable forces happened weeks before Nathaniel's blatant disrespect. Hawthorne Industries was embroiled in a major legal battle, accused of environmental violations that had caused widespread damage to a small, predominantly black community. Nathaniel, of course, denied all wrongdoing, blaming overzealous regulators and unreliable science. His defense team, one of the most expensive in the country, was confident they could outmaneuver any judge. But they hadn't counted on Elise Monroe. At their first meeting in the courtroom, Nathaniel's charm was met with a cold, professional courtesy. He tried to butter her up with compliments about her impressive career, but Elise wasn't impressed. When he subtly hinted at his political connections, her reply was icy. "Mr. Hawthorne, this court doesn't care about who you know. It cares about what you've done." From that moment, Nathaniel viewed her not as a judge, but as an obstacle he intended to bulldoze. In the days leading up to the contemptuous courtroom scene, Nathaniel's arrogance was on full display. He arrived late to hearings, whispered sarcastic comments to his lawyers during proceedings, and made it clear he didn't respect Elise or her authority. But Elise, true to form, didn't let his antics distract her. She let him dig his own grave, brick by brick. And then, on that fateful day, Nathaniel's refusal to stand marked the tipping point. Now, as Nathaniel sat in the holding cell, the weight of his actions began to settle in. His lawyer, a harried man named Greg Larson, was desperately trying to secure his release. "You've made a spectacle of yourself, Nathaniel," Greg hissed over the phone. "Do you realize what's happening out there? The media is having a field day." But Nathaniel was defiant. "I don't care about the media," he snapped. "This is about principle. She humiliated me." Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Judge Monroe prepared to continue the trial, but not before sending a message. With a calm yet firm tone, she addressed the remaining attendees. "Let today serve as a reminder. No one, no matter their wealth or status, is above the law." The gallery erupted into applause. As Nathaniel stewed in his cell, Elise was about to deliver a ruling that would change everything. But what she said and did next would leave not only Nathaniel, but the entire country stunned. Nathaniel paced the narrow confines of the holding cell, his expensive Italian loafers clicking against the cold concrete floor. He wasn't used to this, a place where his money, his power, and his carefully crafted image meant absolutely nothing. The sound of the metallic door rattling as the guard locked it behind him echoed in his ears. The humiliation was unbearable. Back in the courtroom, Judge Elise Monroe moved forward with the day's proceedings, but her mind was working on something bigger. She was no stranger to arrogance. She had seen it from powerful men before. But this was different. It wasn't just about disrespecting her as a judge. It was about undermining her as a black woman in a position of authority, and that cut deeper than words could express. The media, of course, caught wind of the incident almost immediately. By the time Nathaniel's lawyer managed to secure his release from the holding cell, clips of the billionaire's dramatic removal were already circulating online. Social media erupted with divided opinions. Some applauded Judge Monroe's firm stance, calling her a symbol of justice and accountability. Others, however, decried her actions, accusing her of overstepping her authority. Nathaniel's PR team went into damage control mode, drafting a carefully worded statement about how the incident was a misunderstanding. But Nathaniel, sitting at the head of the long, polished table in his Manhattan penthouse, rejected it. "We're not apologizing," he said, his voice sharp. "This is her fault, not mine." Greg Larson, his lawyer, rubbed his temples. "Nathaniel, this isn't just about you anymore. Your actions are being scrutinized under a microscope. You need to." "I need to win," Nathaniel interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. "This is a power play, Greg. She wants to make an example out of me, and I won't let her." Judge Monroe, meanwhile, was preparing for the next phase of the trial. She had seen the headlines, the comments, the endless stream of opinions. But she didn't waver. To her, the case was about more than Nathaniel's contempt of court. It was about justice for the community his company had harmed. As the court reconvened the following morning, the atmosphere was electric. The gallery was packed, with journalists and members of the public eager to see what would happen next. Nathaniel entered the courtroom with a noticeable swagger, his legal team trailing behind him. He glanced at Judge Monroe but said nothing, his expression icy. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," Judge Monroe said, her tone neutral. I trust your time in the holding cell has given you some perspective. Nathaniel smirked, leaning back in his chair. Perspective? Sure. Let's call it that. Elise ignored the bait, turning her attention to the matter at hand. Before we proceed, I'd like to address yesterday's incident. This court is not a stage for theatrics, nor is it a platform for personal grievances. Respect for the judiciary is not optional. It is fundamental to the rule of law. Nathaniel rolled his eyes, earning him a sharp look from Greg. The trial itself began to reveal the extent of Nathaniel's empire's wrongdoings. Witnesses from the affected community testified about the polluted water, the loss of crops, and the health issues that had plagued their families for years. An elderly woman named Ruth Parker recounted how her grandson developed a rare illness linked to the chemicals dumped by Hawthorne Industries. As Ruth spoke, her voice cracking with emotion, Nathaniel stared at the table in front of him, his jaw tightening. For a brief moment, it seemed like her words were reaching him, but then he leaned over to whisper something to Greg. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Judge Monroe, who made a note in her files. That evening, Nathaniel's public relations nightmare grew worse. A leaked video of his sarcastic remark to Judge Monroe spread like wildfire. The clip showed him saying, "Mutual respect goes both ways, Your Honor," in a tone dripping with contempt. The backlash was swift. Activists, celebrities, and even some of Nathaniel's business allies began to distance themselves, condemning his behavior. But Nathaniel didn't care about public opinion. He cared about winning. And to him, Judge Monroe was now the ultimate obstacle. The tension in the courtroom escalated as the trial moved forward. Nathaniel's legal team began deploying aggressive tactics, trying to discredit witnesses and derail the case. But Judge Monroe held firm, refusing to let the proceedings devolve into chaos. On the third day of the trial, Elise presented evidence that stunned the courtroom. Internal emails from Hawthorne Industries that showed company executives knowingly covered up the environmental damage. The emails were damning, painting a picture of greed and indifference that even Nathaniel couldn't talk his way out of. The gallery erupted into gasps and murmurs as the evidence was read aloud. Nathaniel's face turned pale, and for the first time, he looked genuinely rattled. "This cannot be admissible," Greg shouted, his voice cracking under pressure. "This is an ambush." Elise's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Mr. Larson, this evidence was subpoenaed weeks ago. Your client's failure to disclose it is not this court's problem. It is, however, yet another indication of the kind of operation Mr. Hawthorne runs." Nathaniel's eyes locked onto Elise's, and for a moment, it was as if the entire courtroom vanished. It was just the two of them, locked in an unspoken battle of wills. That night, Nathaniel sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city lights. His mind was racing, not with regret, but with plans. He wasn't about to let this judge, ruin him. He had resources, connections, and leverage. There had to be a way to turn this around. But what he didn't realize was that Judge Monroe wasn't done yet. She had one more card to play, and when she revealed it, it would shake Nathaniel's world to its core. The courtroom was quieter than usual the next morning, the tension palpable as everyone anticipated what Judge Monroe had hinted at the day before. Speculation buzzed through the gallery. What else could she possibly have to reveal? The case already seemed to be tilting against Nathaniel Hawthorne, but there was a sense that the storm wasn't over yet. Nathaniel, however, strode in as if he owned the place. Dressed in a sharp charcoal suit with a silk tie, he exuded confidence. His every step, every movement, was calculated to project power. He smirked at the cameras stationed outside the courtroom, his arrogance undimmed despite the damning evidence presented the day before. As he took his seat, he whispered to Greg, "Relax. She's bluffing. They always overplay their hand." Greg didn't look so sure. "Let's hope you're right. Because if she has more evidence, Nathaniel, this could go very badly." Judge Monroe entered the courtroom moments later, her presence commanding respect without a single word. As everyone stood and then sat at her signal, Nathaniel's defiance from days prior felt like a distant memory. He didn't dare repeat the gesture, though his expression remained smug. Elise wasted no time. "Yesterday, This court presented compelling evidence that demonstrated a pattern of negligence and intentional deception on the part of Hawthorne Industries. She began, her voice steady. Today we will build on that foundation. Nathaniel leaned back, a slight smirk playing on his lips. But the smirk faded the moment Elise continued. This court has received testimony from several witnesses about the devastating effects of Mr. Hawthorne's actions on their community, she said, glancing briefly at Nathaniel before turning her attention to the gallery. What the court has not yet addressed is the human cost. She nodded toward the bailiff, who opened the side door. A woman stepped into the courtroom, holding a framed photo. Her face was lined with grief, her eyes puffy from tears. The room collectively held its breath as she made her way to the witness stand. "This is Mrs. Camille Harris," Elise said, her tone softening slightly. "She is the mother of Jordan Harris, a 10-year-old boy who passed away after prolonged exposure to contaminated water near his home." The gallery erupted into gasps, and even Nathaniel seemed taken aback for a moment. He quickly masked his reaction, but his jaw tightened visibly. As Mrs. Harris began to speak, her voice trembling, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. "My son was everything to me," she said, clutching the photo tightly. "He loved science, especially space. He wanted to be an astronaut one day, but he didn't get that chance." Her words cut through the air like a knife, and even the most hardened reporters in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She went on to describe the symptoms Jordan experienced, the countless visits to doctors, and the anguish of watching her child suffer without understanding why. It wasn't until a community organizer conducted tests on the water that the truth came to light. The contamination was traced back to a Hawthorne Industries facility just miles away. "Your Honor, I did everything I could to protect my son," Mrs. Harris said, her voice breaking. "But how do you fight something you don't even know is killing you?" Nathaniel's lawyer objected, attempting to argue that the testimony was prejudicial, but Elise overruled him. "This testimony is not only relevant, but essential to understanding the full scope of this case," she said firmly. As Mrs. Harris stepped down, Judge Monroe addressed the courtroom. "This case is not just about financial damages or legal liability. It's about lives, real people whose futures were stolen because of decisions made by those who placed profit above humanity." Nathaniel clenched his fists under the table. For the first time, the cracks in his armor were showing. The weight of the testimony, combined with the public outrage building outside the courtroom, was beginning to press down on him. But it wasn't over. Judge Monroe looked directly at Nathaniel, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Hawthorne, the court has heard from the victims of your company's negligence. Now we will hear from you." The courtroom buzzed with excitement as Nathaniel was summoned to the stand. He didn't move at first, his confidence visibly shaken. Greg leaned over and whispered, "You have to do this. Refusing will make you look worse." Reluctantly, Nathaniel stood and made his way to the witness stand. The journey felt longer than it should have, each step weighed down by the judgmental stares of the gallery. When he finally sat down, he adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. Elise's questioning was surgical, cutting through his practiced defenses. "Mr. Hawthorne," she began, her tone calm but firm, "you've heard testimony about the consequences of your company's actions. Do you believe Hawthorne Industries bears any responsibility for the harm caused to these families?" Nathaniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "I sympathize with their pain, but there's no definitive proof linking my company to these alleged damages." The gallery murmured in disbelief. Elise leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "No definitive proof? Even with the emails we reviewed yesterday, showing that your executives knowingly concealed evidence of contamination." Nathaniel hesitated, his confidence slipping further. I wasn't aware of those emails until recently," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "And I don't micromanage every aspect of my company." Elise's eyes narrowed. "So you're claiming ignorance as your defense?" "I'm saying I trust my team to handle these matters responsibly," Nathaniel replied, his tone regaining a hint of its former arrogance. Elise let his words hang in the air for a moment before delivering her final question. "Mr. Hawthorne, do you believe trust absolves you of accountability?" The question hit Nathaniel like a punch. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, the courtroom hanging on his every reaction. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered in droves, their signs and chants echoing through the streets. The pressure on Nathaniel was mounting from all sides, and it was clear to everyone in the room that this trial was no longer just about the law. It was about the battle between privilege and justice, between the untouchable and the accountable. Nathaniel left the courtroom that day visibly shaken, his usual bravado replaced by a somber, almost haunted expression. But as he stepped into his black SUV, surrounded by security, a spark of defiance returned to his eyes. Judge Monroe had thrown everything at him, but Nathaniel Hawthorne wasn't finished yet, and what he planned to do next would send shockwaves through the entire case. Nathaniel sat in the back seat of his sleek black SUV, the city flashing by in a blur. His jaw tightened as he replayed the events of the day in his mind. Every word from Judge Monroe, every testimony, every damning piece of evidence. It felt like an assault on everything he'd built. The car turned a corner, the driver carefully navigating the throngs of protesters surrounding the courthouse. Their signs and chants were clear: accountability for all. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar: vulnerability. The fortress he had constructed around himself, his wealth, his influence, his reputation, was showing cracks. But Nathaniel Hawthorne was not a man who folded under pressure. Vulnerability, he decided, was a temporary state, and he had a plan to ensure it stayed that way. The next morning, as the sun rose over Manhattan, Nathaniel made a series of calls. His assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Madison Clark, was tasked with reaching out to every connection he had. Politicians, corporate allies, even media moguls, anyone who could help him shift the narrative. By noon, his penthouse was buzzing with activity. Madison laid out a strategy, her tone brisk. "We need to hit back hard. Spin the story. Paint this as a political hit job. Emphasize your contributions to the economy, your philanthropy." Nathaniel nodded, his mind racing. "And the judge?" Madison hesitated. "She's gaining public sympathy. Going after her directly could backfire." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "Sympathy isn't bulletproof. Find something. Anything." Meanwhile, in the South Side community affected by Hawthorne Industries, the mood was one of cautious hope. For years, they had been ignored, their voices drowned out by corporate interests. But Judge Monroe's handling of the trial was giving them something they hadn't felt in a long time: belief that justice might be possible. Among those watching the trial closely was Marcus Carter, a young activist who had grown up in the very neighborhood impacted by the contamination. Marcus had lost his younger sister to a rare cancer linked to the polluted water. For him, this wasn't just a court case, it was personal. As Marcus prepared to lead another rally outside the courthouse, he received a call from an anonymous number. The voice on the other end was calm, measured. "Mr. Carter, this is Madison Clark. I work for Mr. Hawthorne. I'd like to discuss an opportunity." Marcus stiffened. "What kind of opportunity?" "A financial contribution to your organization," Madison replied smoothly. "We understand your community has suffered, and Mr. Hawthorne would like to help." Marcus clenched his fists. "You think money is going to fix this? You think you can buy us off?" "No," Madison said, unfazed. "But I think we can work together to find solutions. Perhaps you'd like to hear more before dismissing the idea?" Marcus hung up, his heart pounding. The audacity of it. Hawthorne's team trying to manipulate him only fueled his determination. Back in the courtroom, Judge Monroe continued to assert control over the proceedings. Her calm demeanor masked the immense pressure she was under. The media scrutiny, the protests, the personal attacks. She had anticipated it all when she took this case. What she hadn't anticipated, however, was the strange envelope that arrived at her chambers that afternoon. It was unmarked, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its message typed in bold letters: "Step down, or this gets personal." Elise stared at the note, her mind racing. Was it a bluff? An attempt to intimidate her? She had dealt with threats before, but something about this felt different, more targeted. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. This trial wasn't just about Nathaniel Hawthorne anymore. It was about proving that no amount of intimidation could derail justice. The following day, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. Reporters jostled for space, and the protesters outside had grown louder. Nathaniel walked in with his head high, his legal team trailing behind him. But there was a shift in his demeanor, an added layer of confidence. Something had changed. As the session began, Greg Larson stood to address the court. "Your Honor, before we proceed with the day's testimonies, the defense would like to present new evidence that we believe will be relevant to the case." Elise's eyebrows rose slightly. "New evidence? It's highly irregular to introduce new material at this stage." "Explain." Greg stepped forward, holding a thick file. "We've come into possession of documents that suggest the contamination in the affected area may have originated from another source. These documents implicate a nearby manufacturing plant that has no connection to Hawthorne Industries." The gallery erupted into murmurs. Elise tapped her gavel sharply. "Order in the court." Nathaniel sat back, his expression unreadable, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips. Elise studied the file Greg handed to her, her eyes scanning the pages. She frowned. Something about this didn't add up. "Where did this evidence come from?" she asked. Greg hesitated. "An anonymous whistleblower." The answer sent a ripple of suspicion through the courtroom. Judge Monroe's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Larson, I will review this material thoroughly, but let me be clear. Any attempt to mislead this court will have serious consequences." As the session continued, Nathaniel's team pressed hard, using the new evidence to sow doubt in the case against him. But Elise wasn't easily swayed. She called for an independent forensic analysis of the documents, determined to uncover the truth. That evening, Nathaniel hosted a private dinner at his penthouse. The guest list included a mix of political figures and corporate allies, all there to discuss strategies for damage control. As the wine flowed and the conversation grew more candid, Nathaniel made his intentions clear. "This trial isn't just about my company," he said, raising his glass. "It's about sending a message. They want to make an example of me? Fine. I'll show them what happens when they come for someone like me." His words were met with nods of agreement and murmurs of support. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Even among his allies, there were whispers of doubt. How far was Nathaniel willing to go? And at what cost? The next morning, as Judge Monroe reviewed the forensic report on the new evidence, her suspicions were confirmed. The documents presented by Nathaniel's team were forgeries. The realization hit her like a thunderclap, but it also steeled her resolve. She looked out at the crowded courtroom, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to drop the hammer. What she was about to say would ignite a firestorm, one that would shake the trial and Nathaniel Hawthorne's empire to its core. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Judge Monroe entered, her every step exuding a quiet, resolute authority. Nathaniel Hawthorne was seated at the defense table, his confidence restored after the previous day's theatrics. He adjusted his cufflinks casually, casting glances at the reporters eagerly scribbling notes. Elise wasted no time. As soon as the room settled, she addressed the court. "Yesterday, the defense presented new evidence that allegedly implicated a separate entity in the contamination of the affected community. This court has now had the opportunity to review that evidence with the assistance of an independent forensic analyst." Nathaniel's smirk faltered slightly. His lawyer, Greg, stiffened in his seat. Elise's voice sharpened. "The analysis concludes that the documents submitted by the defense were, in fact, forged." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters' pens froze midair, and murmurs of disbelief spread like wildfire. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he quickly masked his discomfort. Greg Larson stood abruptly, his face pale. "Your Honor, I assure you, we had no knowledge that." Elise cut him off with a piercing glare. "Mr. Larson, this is a grave matter. Submitting falsified evidence to this court is not just unethical, it is illegal. The source of these documents will be investigated thoroughly, and those responsible will face severe consequences." Nathaniel leaned over to Greg, whispering harshly, "How could this happen? You told me it was airtight." Greg didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the judge. Outside the courthouse, The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd of protesters and spectators. Marcus Carter, standing with a megaphone in hand, felt a surge of vindication. "This is what we've been fighting for," he shouted to the crowd. "The truth always comes out." News outlets ran breaking headlines within minutes. Hawthorne's defense implodes as forged evidence is exposed. The tide of public opinion, already teetering, began to crash against Nathaniel's carefully constructed image. Inside the courtroom, Judge Monroe continued, her tone measured but unyielding. "This trial has already revealed substantial evidence of negligence and harm caused by Hawthorne Industries. The submission of falsified evidence only strengthens the case against the defense." Nathaniel rose to his feet, his temper finally breaking through his composed facade. "This is a circus. You're biased, and you've been against me from the start," he shouted. Elise's gavel came down sharply. "Mr. Hawthorne, sit down. Your outburst is only adding to the damage you've done to your case." The billionaire hesitated, his face red with fury, before slumping back into his seat. Greg whispered furiously to him, but Nathaniel waved him off. After a recess, the prosecution introduced new witnesses. Among them was an ex-employee of Hawthorne Industries, a mid-level executive named Rebecca Holt. Her testimony was damning. Rebecca, a soft-spoken woman in her mid-30s, recounted how she had been instructed to suppress reports detailing the environmental risks of the company's operations. "I was told to shred documents, to keep quiet, and to prioritize the company's bottom line over everything else," she said, her voice trembling. When the prosecutor asked who had given those orders, Rebecca hesitated before responding. "It came from the top, from Mr. Hawthorne himself." Nathaniel's face darkened, but he said nothing, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The gallery was riveted. The image of Nathaniel as an untouchable titan of industry was crumbling under the weight of evidence and testimony. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Judge Monroe made a statement that would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. "This case is not just about one individual or one company. It is about holding those in power accountable for their actions. This court will not be intimidated, nor will it be swayed by wealth or influence." The gallery erupted into applause, despite the gavel's sharp warning for order. Later that night, Nathaniel sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the glittering skyline. The city he had conquered now felt like an enemy, its lights mocking him. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from his PR team, his legal advisors, even his closest allies. He ignored them all. He replayed Rebecca's testimony in his mind. She had been a loyal employee, someone he barely noticed among the sea of faces in his company. And yet, she had turned on him. He couldn't shake the thought. If someone like her could betray him, who else might follow? Nathaniel poured himself a glass of scotch, his mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He still had resources, connections, and power. If he couldn't win in the courtroom, he would find another way to protect his empire. But what he didn't realize was that the cracks in his foundation were deeper than he knew, and the storm was far from over. The next morning, as the courtroom filled once again, Judge Monroe had a surprise announcement. "This court has issued subpoenas for additional records from Hawthorne Industries. These records will shed further light on the extent of the company's actions." Nathaniel's lawyer immediately objected, citing privacy concerns and overreach, but Elise was unmoved. "The public interest outweighs your objections, Mr. Larson. The subpoenas stand." Nathaniel clenched his fists onto the table. He had underestimated her. This wasn't just about a trial anymore. It was a war, and Judge Monroe had just raised the stakes. Nathaniel stared blankly at the courtroom as Judge Monroe's words echoed in his mind. The subpoenas stand. His usual confidence was now replaced with a gnawing sense of unease. The walls seemed to close in around him, and for the first time in years, he felt cornered. As the courtroom cleared for a recess, Nathaniel stormed out, flanked by his legal team. Reporters shouted questions, their cameras capturing every strained line on his face. His lawyer, Greg Larson, struggled to keep up with his furious pace. "This is a disaster," Nathaniel hissed as they entered a private conference room. "Do you have any idea what they'll find in those records?" Greg swallowed hard. "We've done our best to bury anything incriminating, but if they dig deep enough..." Nathaniel slammed his hand on the table, making everyone in the room flinch. They're not going to dig. Fix this. Greg's face paled. Nathaniel, we're under a microscope. If we try to interfere now, I don't care. Nathaniel's voice rose, his composure cracking. Do whatever it takes. While Nathaniel plotted his next move, Judge Monroe was hard at work reviewing the evidence already presented. The forged documents had added another layer of complexity to the case, and she was determined to unravel the web of deceit surrounding Hawthorne Industries. As the day's session resumed, the prosecution introduced an expert witness, Dr. Michelle Harmon, an environmental scientist who had been studying the contamination caused by Hawthorne Industries. Her testimony was thorough and devastating. Based on our studies, Dr. Harmon explained, pointing to charts and graphs displayed on a screen, the levels of toxins found in the affected area are consistent with the chemicals used by Hawthorne Industries in their manufacturing process. The contamination was not accidental. It was the result of repeated, unchecked dumping. Nathaniel's jaw tightened as the scientist laid out her findings. The gallery hung on her every word, and the weight of the evidence was undeniable. But it was her next statement that delivered the knockout blow. What's particularly troubling, Dr. Harmon continued, is that internal reports from Hawthorne Industries, leaked by whistleblowers, show that the company was aware of these risks years before the contamination was discovered. Nathaniel felt the heat of the gallery's stares. His once untouchable persona was crumbling, and he knew it. As the prosecution rested for the day, Greg leaned over to him, his voice low and urgent. We need to consider a settlement. Nathaniel turned to him, his eyes blazing. A settlement? Do you have any idea what that would mean? It would be an admission of guilt. It might be our only option, Greg replied, his tone firm. The evidence is overwhelming. If this goes to a verdict, they'll bury you. Nathaniel shook his head, his mind racing. A settlement would cost him billions, but worse, it would tarnish his legacy. He couldn't accept that. Not yet. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, Marcus Carter's activism was gaining momentum. The rallies had grown larger, and national media outlets were now covering the case extensively. Marcus became a symbol of resistance, his speeches striking a chord with people across the country. This isn't just about Nathaniel Hawthorne, Marcus declared at a rally. It's about every corporation that thinks they can trample over communities and get away with it. It's about justice, for my sister, for Jordan Harris, and for everyone who has been silenced. His words resonated deeply, and the crowd roared in agreement. But Marcus knew the battle was far from over. Nathaniel Hawthorne wasn't the kind of man who gave up without a fight. That night, Nathaniel made another call. This time, it wasn't to his legal team or PR advisors. It was to someone from his past, a fixer named Victor Kane. Victor was a shadowy figure, known for operating in the gray areas of legality. If there was a way to derail the case, he would find it. Victor, Nathaniel said, his voice low, I need a solution. Victor chuckled on the other end of the line. You don't call me unless it's serious. What's the problem? Nathaniel explained the situation, his voice tinged with desperation. Victor listened silently before responding. This isn't going to be cheap or clean. I don't care, Nathaniel replied. Just make it go away. Victor paused, then said, I'll see what I can do. The following day, the courtroom was abuzz with speculation as the prosecution prepared to present new evidence from the subpoenaed records. The tension was palpable. Nathaniel sat at the defense table, his demeanor cool, but his mind racing. He had no idea what would be revealed or whether Victor's interference would come in time. Judge Monroe entered, her presence commanding. This court will now hear testimony related to the newly obtained records, she announced. The prosecution called a forensic accountant who had analyzed the financial and operational records of Hawthorne Industries. The accountant's findings painted a damning picture of corruption and greed. What we found, the accountant testified, was a deliberate effort to conceal the costs of environmental compliance. Internal memos show that executives, including Mr. Hawthorne, prioritized profit margins over safety regulations. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Nathaniel clenched his fists, his mind racing. This wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. As the testimony continued, Judge Monroe's expression hardened. She was beginning to see the full scope of Nathaniel's actions, and the weight of justice pressed heavily on her shoulders. But just as the prosecution prepared to introduce one final piece of evidence, a set of emails directly implicating Nathaniel, the unthinkable happened. The courtroom lights flickered, and then, in a sudden burst of sparks, the power went out. Gasps filled the room as darkness enveloped the space. Security guards sprang into action, and the judge ordered everyone to remain calm. "What's going on?" Nathaniel whispered to Greg, his voice tinged with suspicion. Greg shook his head, equally confused. "I don't know." As backup lights flickered on, a court official entered the room, whispering urgently to Judge Monroe. Her expression tightened as she turned to address the room. "This court is now in recess," she announced. "We'll reconvene once the issue has been resolved." Nathaniel stood, his mind racing. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone, perhaps Victor, had intervened. But what exactly had been done, and how far would it go? As he exited the courtroom, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on his chest. The storm wasn't just looming anymore. It had arrived, and the next move could change everything. The courtroom remained in chaos after the sudden power outage. Security personnel scrambled to assess the situation, and the gallery buzzed with speculation. Protesters outside the courthouse grew louder, their chants piercing through the thick tension hanging in the air. Nathaniel walked briskly to his SUV, his security detail flanking him. His lawyer, Greg, trailed close behind, whispering urgently, "This is escalating out of control. If this power outage is connected to you..." Nathaniel cut him off with a sharp glare. "Don't be ridiculous. I don't know anything about this." Greg didn't look convinced, but chose to drop the subject. Nathaniel, however, was acutely aware of how closely this disruption aligned with his call to Victor Kane. As he settled into the car, his phone buzzed. A text from Victor flashed on the screen. "Step 1 complete. Call me?" Nathaniel's lips curled into a faint smile, but his relief was short-lived. He still didn't know the full extent of Victor's interference, and whether it would help or backfire. Meanwhile, Judge Elise Monroe sat in her chambers, her brow furrowed in thought. The disruption was unsettling, but what concerned her more was the timing. They had been moments away from introducing critical evidence, a set of emails directly tying Nathaniel to the decisions that led to the contamination. She picked up the phone and called the courthouse administrator. "I want a full report on the power outage. Timing everything." "Yes, Your Honor," the administrator replied. "We're already investigating." Elise ended the call and leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the files before her. If someone was trying to derail this trial, they would quickly learn that she was not easily intimidated. The next morning, the courtroom was packed once again. The power outage had only fueled public interest in the trial, and speculation about foul play dominated the news. Protesters outside the courthouse had doubled in number, their voices a constant reminder of the stakes. Judge Monroe called the session to order, her gavel silencing the gallery. "Before we resume testimony," she began, "I want to address the incident that occurred yesterday. This court will not tolerate any attempt to disrupt these proceedings. Let it be known that we will pursue any leads regarding the cause of the outage." Her eyes swept across the room, lingering briefly on Nathaniel, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting the emails that had been interrupted the day before. As the contents were read aloud, the weight of their implications sank heavily over the room. One email, written by Nathaniel himself, stated plainly, "The cost of compliance isn't worth the investment. Manage the PR fallout instead." Another revealed discussions among top executives about silencing whistleblowers and suppressing environmental impact reports. The evidence was damning, and even Nathaniel's most loyal allies in the gallery began to exchange uneasy glances. Nathaniel's composure began to crack. He leaned over to Greg, his voice low and urgent. "How bad is this?" Greg rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. "It's catastrophic. These emails are the smoking gun. If we don't find a way to counter this, you're finished." But as Greg spoke, Nathaniel's mind was already racing. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Outside the courthouse, Marcus Carter addressed the crowd of protesters. The emails had validated everything he and his community had fought for, and his voice rang out with conviction. "This is the proof we needed," Marcus declared. "For too long, men like Nathaniel Hawthorne have believed they're above the law. But today, we're showing them that no one is untouchable." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy invigorated by the developments. But Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. Nathaniel still had resources, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, Nathaniel met with Victor Kane in a private suite at an upscale hotel. Victor was a tall, imposing figure with sharp features and a cold, calculating demeanor. He sipped a glass of whiskey as Nathaniel paced the room. "You promised results," Nathaniel said, his frustration boiling over. Instead, the evidence was introduced anyway. Victor remained unfazed. "Relax. The power outage was a distraction, not a solution. It gave you time to regroup. Now we move to the next phase." Nathaniel stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "And what's that?" Victor smirked. "Leverage. You may not be able to win this case in court, but you can still win outside of it." The next morning, as the trial resumed, Nathaniel's legal team presented a surprising motion, a request for Judge Monroe to recuse herself from the case. Greg Larson stood confidently before the bench, his tone measured. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that your impartiality in this case has been compromised. Recent leaks to the media suggest a bias against my client, and we request that you step down to ensure a fair trial." The gallery erupted into murmurs, and Elise's expression hardened. "Mr. Larson, do you have evidence to support this claim? Or is this simply an attempt to delay the proceedings?" Greg held up a series of news articles, all featuring unflattering coverage of Nathaniel and glowing praise for Elise. "The perception of bias is enough to cast doubt on these proceedings, Your Honor." Elise remained composed, but inside she seethed. The motion was baseless, but it was a calculated move to undermine her authority. "This court will take a brief recess to review the motion," she said, her voice steady. "We will reconvene shortly." In her chambers, Elise sat with her hands folded, her mind racing. This was a tactic, a desperate attempt to derail the trial. But she also knew the importance of maintaining the court's integrity. If she mishandled this, it could give Nathaniel the advantage he desperately needed. As she prepared her response, her determination only grew. Nathaniel Hawthorne might have money and influence, but he underestimated her resolve. This fight was far from over. The courtroom sat in anxious silence as Judge Monroe re-entered after the recess. The defense's motion to have her recused had added another layer of drama to an already explosive trial. All eyes were on her as she took her seat, her expression as calm and composed as ever. After careful consideration, Elise began, her voice steady. "This court finds no basis for the defense's motion to recuse. The claim of bias is unsubstantiated and appears to be an attempt to delay these proceedings. The motion is denied." The gallery erupted into murmurs, a mix of applause and quiet outrage. Nathaniel's face tightened, his jaw clenched as his plan to unseat the judge crumbled before his eyes. Greg Larson, visibly frustrated, leaned over to whisper something to him, but Nathaniel waved him off. Outside the courthouse, the protesters celebrated the decision. Marcus Carter addressed the crowd, his voice amplified by the megaphone. "This is what justice looks like," he declared. "They tried to silence us, to undermine a fair process, but they failed. This fight isn't over, but we're winning." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy electrified by the developments inside the courtroom. Nathaniel, however, was not one to accept defeat quietly. Back in the private conference room, he vented his fury to Greg and his team. "She's playing this like it's her personal crusade," Nathaniel spat, pacing the room. "If we can't remove her, then we have to make this trial so chaotic she loses control." Greg looked uneasy. "Nathaniel, we're already on thin ice. Any more aggressive moves could blow up in our faces." Nathaniel stopped and turned to him, his eyes blazing. "If you don't have the stomach for this, I'll find someone who does." Greg swallowed hard but said nothing. Meanwhile, Judge Monroe continued to assert control over the trial. That afternoon, the prosecution introduced their final witness, a former senior executive from Hawthorne Industries named Alan Royce. Alan's testimony was the culmination of weeks of evidence, tying Nathaniel directly to the company's most egregious practices. "I was in the room when the decisions were made," Alan said, his voice steady but remorseful. Mr. Hawthorne made it clear that profitability was the only priority. When concerns were raised about environmental risks, he dismissed them, saying, "We'll handle the fallout when it happens." The gallery was silent, every word landing like a blow. Nathaniel glared at Alan, his expression a mix of fury and betrayal. When the prosecution finished questioning Alan, Greg rose for the defense's cross-examination. His tone was sharp, almost combative. "Mr. Royce, isn't it true that you were terminated from Hawthorne Industries for incompetence?" Alan didn't flinch. "I was let go because I refused to cover up the contamination." Greg smirked, shaking his head. "So, you're telling this court that after being terminated, you suddenly decided to come forward with these claims? Isn't it possible you're here out of spite?" Alan looked directly at Nathaniel before responding. "I'm here because it's the right thing to do." As the session ended for the day, Nathaniel sat at the defense table, his mind racing. He had spent years insulating himself from consequences, using his wealth and influence to crush anyone who stood in his way. But this trial was different. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, he felt genuinely vulnerable. That night, Nathaniel received another call from Victor Kane. "The pressure's mounting," Victor said. "If you want to survive this, you need to stop playing defense. Hit them where it hurts." Nathaniel frowned. "And how do you suggest I do that?" Victor's tone was cold and calculating. "The judge. Find something. Everyone has skeletons in their closet. You just need to know where to look." Nathaniel hesitated. Going after Judge Monroe felt like a desperate move, but desperation was exactly where he was. "Do it," he said finally. "I don't care what it takes." The following morning, as Judge Monroe entered the courtroom, there was an unusual tension in the air. Nathaniel's legal team seemed energized, their confidence inexplicably restored. Elise took her seat, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Before we proceed," Greg announced, rising from his seat, "the defense would like to submit new evidence." Elise raised an eyebrow. "New evidence? This is highly irregular at this stage of the trial. What evidence are you referring to?" Greg held up a file. "We've uncovered information regarding a conflict of interest involving Your Honor. It pertains to a financial donation made to your campaign for judge by an organization connected to this case." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Elise's face remained unreadable, but her grip on the gavel tightened. Greg continued, his voice steady but accusatory. "This raises serious questions about your ability to remain impartial in these proceedings. We request an immediate suspension of the trial pending further investigation." The room erupted into chaos, reporters scribbling furiously and spectators shouting in disbelief. Marcus Carter, seated in the gallery, looked stunned. "This is a smear campaign," he whispered to a fellow activist. "They're trying to discredit her." Judge Monroe tapped her gavel sharply, bringing the room to order. "Mr. Larson, this court will not tolerate baseless accusations. If you have evidence, present it. If not, I suggest you reconsider your strategy." Greg handed the file to the bailiff, who delivered it to Elise. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. For a moment, she said nothing, and the courtroom held its collective breath. "This document," she said finally, her voice measured, "contains a record of a donation made to my campaign by an independent advocacy group. While this group may have interests aligned with the plaintiffs, there is no direct connection to this case. Your claim of conflict is unsubstantiated." The gallery let out a collective sigh of relief, but Greg wasn't finished. "Your Honor, the perception of bias alone is enough to call this trial into question." Elise's gaze hardened. "Perception is not evidence, Mr. Larson. Your motion is denied." As the trial continued, Nathaniel's frustration grew. Every attempt to derail the case had failed, and Judge Monroe's resolve remained unshaken. But in the shadows, Victor Kane continued his work, digging deeper into Elise's life, searching for anything that could turn the tide. Nathaniel knew the fight wasn't over. He still had cards to play, and when he played them, they would change the game entirely. The courtroom was electric with tension as the trial reached its final stretch. The evidence against Nathaniel Hawthorne had mounted to a staggering level, and the public's eyes were glued to every development. News anchors dissected each twist and turn, and social media was ablaze with debates. Yet behind closed doors, Nathaniel wasn't backing down. He was preparing to strike. Victor Kane's relentless digging had finally unearthed something. A series of personal emails from years prior, showing that Judge Elise Monroe had once corresponded with a prominent environmental activist. The emails were innocuous on their face, discussions about policy and justice, but Victor spun them as proof of bias. The narrative he crafted painted Elise not as a neutral arbiter, but as someone with an agenda. The next morning, Nathaniel's team made their move. Greg Larson stood confidently as the session began. "Your Honor," he said, his tone sharp, "the defense has come into possession of evidence that we believe further supports our claim of bias. With the court's permission, we would like to introduce these emails into the record." Elise's eyes narrowed. "Emails, Mr. Larson? What exactly do you claim they show?" Greg handed a thick file to the bailiff, who delivered it to Elise. "These emails reveal correspondence between Your Honor and an environmental activist organization. Given the nature of this trial, these communications raise serious concerns about impartiality." The gallery erupted in whispers. Marcus Carter, seated among the spectators, looked alarmed. "They're grasping at straws," he muttered, but even he felt a pang of worry. Elise scanned the emails, her face unreadable. She recognized the correspondence immediately. It was from over a decade ago, during her time as a legal advisor on environmental policy. The discussions were purely academic, focused on justice and legal frameworks. But in the hands of Nathaniel's team, they had been reframed as something far more sinister. "Mr. Larson," Elise said, her voice calm but firm, "these emails are from long before I became a judge. They have no bearing on my ability to preside over this case." Greg wasn't deterred. "Your Honor, the mere fact that you engaged with these organizations undermines the perception of neutrality." Elise's eyes flashed with quiet anger. "Perception is not reality, Mr. Larson. Unless you have evidence of actual misconduct, I suggest we move on." But the damage was already done. The gallery buzzed with speculation, and the media outside the courthouse pounced on the story. Headlines immediately framed Elise as a potentially biased figure, and Nathaniel's PR team worked overtime to amplify the narrative. That evening, Elise sat alone in her chambers, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She had always known this trial would be difficult, but the personal attacks were cutting deeper than she had anticipated. Still, she reminded herself why she had taken this case in the first place: to stand up for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Her phone buzzed, a message from Marcus Carter. "Stay strong, Judge Monroe. We believe in you." Elise smiled faintly, the words a small but meaningful comfort. She knew Marcus and the community were counting on her to see this trial through, no matter the challenges. Meanwhile, Nathaniel sat in his penthouse, sipping a glass of scotch as he watched the news. The coverage was exactly what he had hoped for: endless speculation about Elise's impartiality. His lawyer, Greg, sat across from him, looking more relaxed than he had in weeks. "This will buy us some time," Greg said. "If nothing else, it casts doubt on the integrity of the trial." Nathaniel smirked. "Good. Let the media tear her apart. By the time this is over, no one will care about the emails or the contamination." Victor Kane, seated quietly in the corner, finally spoke. "Careful, Nathaniel. This isn't over. You've stirred the pot, but Monroe isn't the type to back down. You need to be ready for her next move." Nathaniel waved him off. "Let her come. She's playing checkers. I'm playing chess." The next day, Judge Monroe called the court to order. Her calm demeanor belied the storm swirling around her. "This court acknowledges the defense's concerns regarding impartiality," she began, "but I will remind all parties that this trial is about the facts. It is about accountability and justice for those who have been harmed." Her words resonated with the gallery, and for a moment, the room was still. But the tension returned as the prosecution introduced its final piece of evidence: a video deposition from a former Hawthorne Industries employee, Mary Collins. Mary, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, appeared on the screen. Her eyes were weary, but her voice was clear as she described the culture at Hawthorne Industries. Everything was about cutting costs, she said. We were told to ignore safety protocols, to falsify reports if necessary. I tried to speak up, but I was shut down. Eventually, I was fired. The prosecutor leaned forward. Who gave those orders, Miss Collins? Mary hesitated, then said, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He made it clear that profit was the only thing that mattered. The gallery erupted into murmurs. Nathaniel's face darkened, but he maintained his composure, barely. As the day's proceedings wrapped up, Elise addressed the court. This trial is nearing its conclusion. The evidence has been presented, and it is now up to this court to ensure that justice is served. I urge everyone in this room, and those watching beyond these walls, to focus on the facts. Her words were a direct rebuke to the distractions Nathaniel's team had tried to create. But as she left the courtroom that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. Nathaniel had one final move left to play, and when he made it, it would be the most devastating yet. The courtroom was silent, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing outside. Protesters chanted, reporters swarmed, and social media was ablaze with speculation. Inside, Judge Monroe sat with an unshakable resolve, ready to deliver a ruling that would echo far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Nathaniel Hawthorne, however, wasn't done fighting. That morning, Nathaniel had received a package. Inside was a USB drive from Victor Kane with a note. This is your ace. Use it wisely. The drive contained a video, grainy but clear enough to recognize the key players. It showed Judge Monroe at a private fundraiser held by an environmental advocacy group years before her judicial appointment. In the video, Elise was seen giving a speech about holding corporations accountable for environmental harm. The content wasn't damning in itself, but Victor had doctored the video, editing it to make it appear that Elise had explicitly targeted Hawthorne Industries. The final version was a bombshell, suggesting a personal vendetta against Nathaniel. Nathaniel's legal team debated the ethics of using such footage. Greg Larson, despite his loyalty, looked uneasy. Nathaniel, if this comes out as fabricated. No one will care, Nathaniel interrupted. It's about planting doubt. Perception is reality. Remember? As the session began, Greg rose from his seat. Your Honor, he said, his tone calculated. The defense has one final piece of evidence to present. With the court's permission, we'd like to submit this video into the record. Elise's eyes narrowed. Proceed. The video was played on the courtroom screen, and gasps rippled through the gallery. The edited footage made it seem as though Elise had explicitly named Hawthorne Industries as a target, accusing the company of being a threat to justice long before this trial. When the video ended, the room erupted into murmurs. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. Marcus Carter, seated in the gallery, whispered fiercely to his fellow activists, "That's not real. I've seen the original speech. She never said any of that." Elise's expression didn't change as she addressed Greg. "Mr. Larson, the authenticity of this video is highly questionable. Where did you obtain it?" Greg hesitated, glancing at Nathaniel. The defense received it anonymously. Elise raised an eyebrow. Anonymously? Convenient. This court will immediately order a forensic analysis of this footage. Until its authenticity can be verified, it will not be considered admissible evidence. Nathaniel's smirk faltered. This wasn't going as planned. While the forensic analysis was underway, Elise turned her attention back to the case itself. This trial has seen extraordinary efforts to distract and discredit. But let me remind everyone in this room, this case is about the truth. Her words cut through the noise, restoring order to the chaotic atmosphere. Hours later, the results of the forensic analysis came in. The video was declared doctored, with clear evidence of manipulation. Elise didn't wait to address the courtroom. "The submission of falsified evidence is a grave offense," she said, her voice sharp. "This court will be referring this matter for investigation. Mr. Larson, I suggest you prepare to explain your actions to the appropriate authorities." Nathaniel's face turned red, but he didn't speak. The room buzzed with whispers, the tide turning decisively against him. As the trial reached its climax, Elise delivered her closing remarks. This case is a stark reminder that no one is above the law, not billionaires, not corporations, not anyone. The evidence presented has shown a clear pattern of negligence and deception by Hawthorne Industries. This court will now deliberate on its final judgment. The gallery erupted into applause, though Elise's gavel quickly restored order. That evening, Nathaniel sat alone in his penthouse, the weight of his defeat sinking in. His empire, once untouchable, was crumbling. The trial had exposed his greed, his arrogance, and his willingness to manipulate the system for his gain. Victor Kane called, but Nathaniel didn't answer. He knew this was the end of the road. The next morning, the judgment was delivered. Hawthorne Industries was found liable for the contamination and ordered to pay billions in damages to the affected community. Nathaniel himself faced separate legal proceedings for his role in the deception. Outside the courthouse, Marcus Carter addressed a jubilant crowd. "This isn't just a victory for us," he said. "It's a victory for everyone who has ever been silenced, ignored, or trampled by the powerful. Justice has prevailed." In her chambers, Elise sat quietly, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The attacks, the challenges, the relentless pressure, it had all been worth it. Justice had been served, and she had stood firm in the face of overwhelming opposition. As she packed her files, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Thank you for everything, Judge Monroe. You've given us hope." Elise smiled, a rare moment of satisfaction. This battle was over, but the fight for justice was never ending. For Nathaniel Hawthorne, the fall was swift and unforgiving. His name became synonymous with greed and arrogance, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused. And for the world watching, this trial was a reminder. Even the mighty can fall, and when they do, it's justice that rises in their place.